Great Expectations, Chapter 3, Great Expectations. For the next few months, I visited Miss Havisham every day. Each time, mean Estella teased and taunted me. But I was fascinated by her. I could not bear to be away from her. On one visit, Miss Havisham was waiting for me in a wheelchair. She wanted me to push her around her bedroom, then across the landing and into the room next door. This room was filled with dust and cobwebs. A long table was set for a wedding feast. Mice nibbled on a rotten wedding cake lying in the center of the table. By now, I was used to Miss Havisham's strange ways. This bizarre room didn't even surprise me. Miss Havisham was quiet at first. She talked more as she got used to me. She asked me what I was learning and what I wanted to be when I grew up. I told her I would soon become Joe's apprentice. I told her the blacksmith's trade did not interest me. I wanted to be a gentleman and live in the big city. Secretly, I hoped Miss Havisham would help me, but she never paid me money. I spent time with Estella. In return, Miss Havisham gave me dinner. That was all. One day, Miss Havisham asked me to bring Joe to her. "You are growing tall, Pip," she said. "You should be learning your life's trade from a master." I brought Joe to Miss Havisham's room the very next day. Joe was nervous. He twisted his cap in his hands. He looked at me when he answered Miss Havisham's questions. "You raised this boy to be your apprentice," began Miss Havisham. "Is that right, Mr. Gargery?" "You know, Pip," replied Joe, looking at me. "We've always been friends. It would be a lark to work together. You want to, don't you, Pip?" I tried to get Joe to speak to Miss Havisham instead of me, but he wouldn't. His shyness made me ashamed, especially when I saw that Estella was laughing at us. "I want you to be Mr. Gargery's apprentice. Here is some money," said Miss Havisham. She dropped a sack of coins into my hand. "You have earned it, Pip. Give the money to your new master. You will make a fine blacksmith one day." After that day, my visits ended. I took my place at the forge. I welded horseshoes, buckets, and machinery. My heavy heart made the hammers and tools I worked on seem as light as a feather. I lived in fear that one day Estella would peek in the window and see me working. My hands and face would be black from coal. Estella would despise me more than she already did. Then she would run away in disgust, and I would never see her again. One day blended into another. About a year later, I asked Joe if I could visit Miss Havisham. "She might think you want something," he replied. "But I have never thanked her or shown that I remember her," I said. I missed my visits to that strange house. Most of all, I missed Estella. "Since we aren't so busy right now, Joe," I said, "I would like to take a half day off tomorrow and call on Miss Havisham." "Her name ain't Estavisham," said Joe with a twinkle in his eye, "unless someone has given her a new name." "I know, Joe, I know," I said, "but may I go?" Joe gave me the time off. Orlick, Joe's other worker, demanded the same, but my sister told Joe not to give it to him. My sister did not like Orlick. She thought he was lazy. She and Orlick were always fighting. In the end, Joe gave Orlick the time off to keep him happy. I couldn't wait to see Estella again. I scrubbed the grit from my hands and put on my clothes with the least patches and tears. When I arrived at Miss Havisham's, she told me that Estella was in Europe. "She's getting an education," said Miss Havisham. "She's prettier than ever and admired by all who see her. Do you feel that you have lost her?" I didn't know what to say. I left Miss Havisham's more unhappy about my home and my life than ever before. A heavy mist hung in the air. Around a bend in the road, I met Orlick. "The guns are going again," he said. "At the hulks?" I asked. "Aye," he replied. "Some of the birds have flown their cages." I immediately remembered the night in the graveyard with my convict. I was almost home when a neighbor ran up to me. "Convicts broke into your house when Gargery was out. Somebody was attacked and hurt," he cried. I ran straight home. Practically the whole village was in our yard. I found Joe and a doctor in the kitchen. My sister was lying on the floor. She looked as if she was dead. She had been hit many times on her head and back. Leg irons lay beside her. They had been filed through a long time ago, Joe said. They were my convict's irons, but somehow I knew my convict didn't do this terrible thing. The attacker must have found the irons in the churchyard. Orlick hated my sister. He was the only man capable of such a dreadful crime, but there was no evidence to prove him guilty. I felt responsible because I had provided the weapon. For months I wanted to tell Joe the story, but every day I kept silent. My sister lived, but never spoke again. Instead, she wrote messages on a slate. Now it took her a long time to understand things, and she became a patient and gentle woman. She never lost her temper again. She was sometimes unhappy, but never angry. Biddy, the schoolteacher's granddaughter, came to live with us. She helped me and Joe watch over my sister and tend to the household chores. Biddy was clever and kind, but not as outwardly beautiful as Estella. Her beauty was inside. How I wished I could love her as I loved Estella. I knew my life would be less painful if I could fall in love with simple, good-hearted Biddy.